Okay, so you know how sometimes you get this like nagging feeling and it's like you're only seeing the tip of the iceberg with a certain news story.
Mm-hmm.
Well, today's topic is definitely one of those. We're talking about the Youth Secure Unit System.
Okay.
We're going deep on this, but specifically focusing on like one person's experience, their observations as shared in this YouTube video excerpt we found.
And that's a really critical point to start with, right? This is what just one perspective, one slice of like a much, much larger, and let's be honest, a very complex system.
Totally. It's like we hear about these facilities, right? These secure units, but it's usually when something bad happens.
Right.
So it's like, what about the day-to-day realities for the young people who are actually like living in those places?
Yeah.
Our source today, he claims to pull back the curtain on that. And honestly, some of what he describes is, well, it's intense, especially like when it comes to transparency, or should I say the lack of it?
Yeah, it's what I find so fascinating is how this source, he keeps coming back to this idea, and it's like the inner workings of this whole youth care system, it's almost like it's intentionally obscured.
Right.
He uses this phrase, and I'm quoting here, everything to do with kids flies under the radar. Almost like these systems operate with this like crazy level of secrecy that makes it almost impossible to really monitor what's actually happening inside.
Yeah, and it's like he actually argues that all these laws and regulations, while they're like well-intentioned, he's saying that they might actually be part of the problem.
Oh, interesting.
Because it's like they create this false sense of security, right? It's like we assume that everything is fine because there are rules.
Right.
But without transparency, how can we be sure those rules are even being followed?
Exactly.
And more importantly, what does that say about like who these systems are really designed to protect?
It raises really uncomfortable questions about like the power dynamics at play and about accountability, right? Like if it's this hard for people on the outside, even family members, to get a clear picture of what's going on, are these systems truly accountable to anyone? You know what I mean?
Yeah, and it's a little unsettling, right? Like you start to wonder if it's that hard to get information, what else might be going on that we don't know about?
Exactly.
And that leads us to the source's account of what he claims is happening to these kids, especially when it comes to like physical restraint techniques.
Yeah.
And it's rough.
Yeah, it's not just the claims themselves, right? But it's the language that he uses. It really paints this vivid and honestly disturbing picture.
Right.
He uses phrases like picked up off his, then thrown around like a plazy bag, marched into the corner, twist you up. I mean, these aren't like, clinical terms from a textbook.
Right.
It's raw, it's visceral, and it really speaks to a potential level of force being used that's concerning, to say the least.
It's tough to hear. Absolutely. And he even goes so far as to suggest that some staff, I don't know, maybe even looking for opportunities to use force, like they're looking for an excuse. I don't know.
That's a heavy accusation.
It is. It is.
And it's one that we have to be careful not to oversimplify. It's critical to remember that this is one person's experience. But it does raise a super important question. Even if those examples of force that he describes, even if those were considered justified, by some internal metric, what is that doing to a young person psychologically and emotionally?
Yeah.
Especially when you consider the fact that a lot of these kids are coming from backgrounds where violence or instability was already the norm.
And that's where his argument about emotional well-being really hit me. He talks about this 14-year-old kid who was denied a phone call to his family.
Oh, wow.
And he's not just saying this as like a one-off incident.
Right.
He's saying this to illustrate a larger pattern of what he sees as like systemic emotional neglect.
And I think that's a crucial distinction, right? He's not just talking about, this staff member was mean to this kid.
Right.
He's suggesting a systemic failure to like meet the basic emotional needs of these young people, which honestly can be just as damaging as any physical harm.
Right. Because you put yourself in those shoes, right? You're young. You're in a stressful, unfamiliar environment. You're probably scared. I mean, I would be. And all you want is to connect with somebody, somebody who cares.
Absolutely, yeah.
And to be met with indifference or even worse, hostility, during what's probably already a traumatic experience. I mean, that's going to leave a mark,
Sure.
And he touches on this briefly, but he mentions a documentary, I think it was about a mental hospital, where they were keeping these young girls isolated. And they could only talk to people through, like, shatterproof glass.
Oh, my gosh.
Like, come on.
Yeah.
It's almost like he's drawing a parallel. Like, this is bigger than just one facility. It's indicative of a much larger problem within these systems as a whole.
Right. And again, we have to be super careful about making broad generalizations based on just, a few anecdotes. But it does make you wonder, right? Like, if these examples of potential mistreatment, both physical and emotional, are as common as he says they are, then what does that say about the systems themselves?
And this is where it gets even more, I don't know, complicated.
Yeah.
Because he starts talking about how this, like, potential for mistreatment, both physical and emotional, it can actually make the very problems these secure units are trying to fix, like, even worse. It's like he's describing this cycle of mistreatment.
Yeah, and this idea of a cycle, it's like so important to understanding his perspective. He's basically saying that so many of these kids, they're coming from these backgrounds where they've already experienced like major trauma, right? Abuse, neglect, all of the things that might have even like led them to being in the system in the first place.
Right.
And then he's suggesting that they're put into this whole other environment where those same patterns of trauma, it's like they're being repeated or even like reinforced.
Right. So instead of like, I don't know, breaking the cycle, it's like he says the system is perpetuating it. Those were his words.
Exactly. And it really makes you think, like, if a young person has only ever experienced violence or like crazy instability as a way of controlling them, and then they experience those things again, but this time it's in the system that's supposed to be helping them, I mean, what message does that send?
Yeah, for sure.
How are they supposed to learn to trust or to heal or to even imagine like a different way of living,
It's a bleak picture, I'm not going to lie. And he really like drives his point home when he tells this personal anecdote. It's intense.
Yeah.
He talks about when he was incarcerated and he just felt so hopeless and unheard that he resorted to self-harm just to try and get anyone to like notice him and like what he needed.
Oh, wow. That's heavy.
It's really heartbreaking, honestly. And it's even worse when he describes how he says the guards reacted. It wasn't with concern or compassion. It's like he's saying they were just like indifferent.
Wow.
It's like even when he was at his most vulnerable, the system still failed him.
And you know what I find really insightful? It's how he compares his own reaction, right? Having already been through so much in the system, to how someone younger or more vulnerable might act in that same situation.
Right.
He's basically saying that someone who hasn't like become numb to that level of harshness, they might totally fall apart in that situation.
Yeah, it's like he's saying the system itself, the way it is now, it might actually be making these behaviors worse, not better.
Right.
And that is scary.
It's terrifying. And it makes us really examine, like, what are we expecting from these types of places,
Right.
Are they just there to punish, to control these kids, to just warehouse them? Or are they really about rehabilitation, about healing, about actually giving them a real chance to grow and change?
Right. Because if we're being honest, if the goal is to like actually rehabilitate these kids, shouldn't we be coming at this whole thing from a totally different perspective?
100%.
Shouldn't compassion and understanding be like the priority instead of just punishment and control all the time?
Absolutely. And I think that's what makes his story and what makes his whole perspective so important,
Yeah.
It makes us really look at how disconnected things are between what these systems are saying they're doing and what's actually happening to these kids every day.
It's like we can't just sit back and be like, oh, the system will fix itself.
Yeah.
We have to actually, as a society, we have to demand better.
Yeah.
We have to advocate for these kids who don't really have a voice.
And that starts by actually listening to the people who have experienced it firsthand, like the source that we're talking about today. His experience, while it's his own, should really be a wake-up call for all of us.
So to do what? What can we actually do? Where do we even begin with something this big? I know it feels kind of overwhelming, Like how do we even begin to like untangle something this big, this ingrained?
Yeah, it's definitely a lot, that's for sure. But I think the first thing is like we have to realize that this isn't just going to fix itself. We can't just hope for the best. We have to be willing as a society to talk about this stuff, even if it's hard.
Yeah.
We have to be willing to shine a light on the fact that this is happening, and we have to demand better for these kids.
Okay, so that's what we're talking about, right? Like demanding they're more transparent, holding them accountable, like the total change in how they do things. But how? How do we make them do that? Who's actually in charge of like making those changes?
Well, and I think this is important. It's not about blaming people. It's about realizing that we all have a part to play here. We can start by educating ourselves about this stuff, like actually listening to the people who have been through it and supporting those groups that are already doing the work.
So it's like we need to make sure that the people who have experienced this, like their voices are heard, right?
Exactly.
Like our source, this guy we're talking about, I mean, his story was his experience, but it just shows that there are these big systemic problems that we can't just ignore.
And we have to do more than just acknowledge it, right? Like, we need to be contacting our elected officials, these policymakers, anybody who has the power to actually change things.
And not just when something bad happens, right?
Right.
It's like we have to try to prevent this from happening in the first place.
Exactly.
Investing in things for these communities, mental health resources, giving these kids a chance to get a good education, stuff that might keep them from ending up in these places to begin with.
That's exactly it. It's about being proactive, not reactive. Like, if we really want to stop this cycle of mistreatment, we've got to start thinking about the well-being of these kids way before they ever even come close to one of these facilities.
It's about, like, creating a world where it doesn't matter where you came from or what your situation is. Every young person feels seen, heard, valued.
Supported.
Right.
Yes. Exactly. Like recognizing how much they're worth and creating systems that show that, systems that would rather see them heal and grow than punish and control.
So as we kind of wrap up this deep dive here, what's the one thing you really hope our listeners take away from all of this?
Honestly, I hope they come away from this realizing, like, this is urgent and we all have to be a part of it. This isn't somebody else's problem to fix. It's on all of us. We can't just sit back and, like, hope it gets better. We got to stay informed, stay engaged, and just keep fighting for a future where every kid, every single one, has a chance to actually thrive.
Because at the end of the day, these aren't like statistics or numbers on a piece of paper. You know,
Yeah.
we're talking about real lives.
Yeah.
Kids with futures. And I think, if nothing else, that's what this guy's story, it reminds us of. It's like he's calling on every single one of us to do something.
It's a call to listen, to learn, to act, and in the end, to build a world that is actually worthy of these young people and all they can be.
That's a great place to leave it.